We'll try this resume. That's okay. The origins of this particular presentation go back almost 20 years. 20 years ago, I was down in Australia for an international conference on IT. And on the first day of the conference, the keynote speaker was the Chief Executive Officer of one of Australia's largest and oldest banking groups. And he stood up to this presentation and to do his presentation. And I remember his opening words exactly, because it certainly caught my attention. My attention is about that of a goldfish. It caught my attention. It also caught the attention of the press, because his opening words were, "I think that IT is a complete waste of money." Now you can imagine this is an IT conference, and I listened very carefully to what he subsequently said. And what it really came down to, it's not that he believed that IT was a complete waste of money, though that grabbed the headlines. He was expressing his frustration that IT couldn't prove to him the value they were adding to the business. Now, most chief information officers, they know their costs. They know what their budget is. They know what they've been allocated to actually spend. And this chief executive was basically saying, every year, the CIO comes to me with his budget, and there are more zeros on the end of it than there were in the previous year. And I can't see what I'm actually getting for this. So, of course, being down in Australia, that evening, I went to search out the Chief Information Officer of the bank concerned. Now, in Australia, it's pretty easy to come across the Chief Information Officer. You just go to the bar. So I went down to the bar to find this guy, and he was several drinks ahead of me by the time I got there. And I introduced myself and explained that I was primarily an assurance provider. And I was really quite interested in his views on what his chief executive had actually said in the keynote presentation. Now, I've had to translate this from the Australian because I'm not allowed to use the profanities in this audience and presentation. He basically said, that gentleman doesn't know what he's talking about. He doesn't know the value I'm bringing to the business. To which I responded, well, that's your fault, isn't it? I took a step back just to be safe. And he said, John, he said, in all honesty, I haven't got time for all this MBA stuff. He said, I'm providing a service. And I said, yeah, but you don't know what the value of that service is to the business. He said, I don't know how to calculate it. So I said, well, let's do it the other way around. Let's assume there was no IT in your business. How much would it cost to run the business? Well, he said, there's a lot more people. I said, well, let's take an average salary of X $1,000 and we'll multiply that by the extra people you think you'll need. And where are these people going to sit? Well, they need more buildings. So we started building up this model of a life in the bank without IT to support it. And of course, the end number was a very, very, very large number. Plus, of course, as he quite rightly pointed out, and they wouldn't get the 2-second response time they're getting at the moment. So I said, so the value you add to the business is that big number we've just calculated, take away the cost of IT at the moment, and that's the value you're adding to the business. And he said, but that is the value of the business. That's the total value of the business, and that's my point. The value of IT to the business in most businesses today is the value of the business. So instead of saying IT is costing us £100 million, they should be saying IT is bringing £50 billion to the table in added value. So that was my sort of starting position on this almost 20 years ago. And since then I've been looking at ways of how do we as assurance providers add value to the business? And this was brought to a head about 5 or 6 years ago when I was invited to do a presentation to the board of a financial services company in London. And I was asked by the chief internal auditor to give a presentation on why he felt there was a need for more IT audit in the organisation. And I started doing my presentation, and halfway through it, I was interrupted by one of the insurance underwriters, and he said, "Yeah, but what value are you going to bring to the business?" And I said, "Well, the value goes a bit like this. A couple of months ago, I pointed out to your Chief Information Officer, who I notice is not represented on the board, that you have no control over your critical spreadsheets." He asked what was the solution, and I proposed a solution. It was going to cost £50,000. Now, to this huge insurance company, that was small change. It was probably the chairman's expenses for a weekend at one of these country houses. The fact is, they didn't want to spend the £50,000 because they said they were going to come up with a better solution at a cheaper cost. Value for money, and I'm all for that. But of course, what happened was 18 months went by and they hadn't sorted out their control over their critical spreadsheets, and they were then fined £1.6 million by what the predecessor of the Financial Conduct Authority. So my argument here is I was adding value by telling them where they had a problem and giving them a value-added solution to it, and they're free to reject it or not, as the case may be. No, I think you're quite right. The question really along the line is, boards are there to spend money, but they spend millions and billions. So £50,000 is not even on their horizon. And it shouldn't have been on their horizon, I totally agree. That was a Chief Information Officer's situation. He had to actually make a value judgment on whether £50,000 was worthwhile, and he actually got it wrong. Politics entered into the decisions. You look at any board, and there's a huge amount of politics in it. There's also a huge amount of risk on the board, and there's also two people on the board who have diametric positions on risk. You have the Chief Finance Officer, who's totally risk averse, and the Chief Marketing Officer, who is a great risk taker. Now, it's the job of the Chief Executive to actually balance those out, to know when to take the risk and when not to actually take the risk. The thing is, they haven't got it through their heads that IT is the value of the business. And if they lose IT or a part of IT, or if there's an IT problem, it costs them a lot of money, as is illustrated by some of the actual things here. The actual money that they're actually risking based on their reputation, devaluation of the share price, regulatory fines, bad publicity, are usually far higher than it would cost them to actually sort out a potential control problem as soon as they're made aware of it. But of course, it doesn't stop there. We have all these other ones as well. More recently, of course, Tesco, 40,000 accounts hacked into, money taken from about half of them. Not huge amounts individually, but it was the impact upon their prestige within the business community. Today, your front page of your website is your company. And if that website is defaced in some way, it says to your customers, why should I trust them with my personal data? Why should I trust them with my bank details if they can't even keep their home front page clear from hacking and manipulation? So the financial impact on the brand of an IT failure is absolutely much, much larger than one would think if you just look at it from the point of view, oh, we had a business disruption, let's get back online. But of course, the really big money is financial services. These people are in the headlines. You are trusting these people with your money, with your log-on details, with lots of other details about you, anything from national insurance numbers, date of birth, which you've probably lied about like I do anyway, gender, but you can lie about that these days anyway. The fact is, there's an awful lot of information out there in the social networking arena where people can take snippets of information from one provider, link it to snippets of information in another provider, and get a complete profile of what you actually look like, what you do, and what your mother's maiden name is, and all these other little security hints you have to fight your way through. £53 billion in fines in the last 16 years. Which brings me, of course, is does assurance add value to the business? So I come into your business and I will measure you against usually some sort of compliance baseline. And if I find a deviation of that baseline, I will draw it to your attention. And then really it's up to your business to make the decision. It's not my job to tell you how to run your business. I can tell you that you're running it quite well, or you're not so good in certain areas. And you then have to make a business decision as to whether it's worthwhile perhaps spending some money to actually sort out the challenge that I've given you in those areas where maybe you're not as good as what would be considered an acceptable level of behaviour. But that's your decision, it's not mine. All I can do is indicate what the cost is likely to be if ever this came into the public domain. And I assure you, it always comes into the public domain at the wrong time. So governance is the responsibility of the main board. They delegate that governance down through the management structure to directors of functions, and directors of functions will then put it down a little bit further to individual line managers. But ultimately, that all builds up to either being okay or being not okay. And it really much is a binary choice these days. You're either okay or you're not. And it's as simple as that. Now, if I can give you assurance that you're okay because you're complying perhaps with one of the ISO standards, you're complying with ISO 27000, you've got good information security, the fact that you're actually accredited to the international standard means you're being audited on a regular basis, so you get continuous assurance that you're okay, then that's good. Because if something does go wrong, and believe me it will, you can at least say, what was better than us being accredited to the international standard? There is nothing better. We're accredited to international standard, but somehow it was breached. Now, you really can't blame us too much for that because we were doing the best we actually could, or trying to do. But if you're not accredited to the international baseline, then you're fair game because you for whatever reason, have decided that baseline was not appropriate, but now you've been exposed and you haven't even got the defence of saying we will work into best practice. You're actually very, very vulnerable as a result. So this is my job. My job is to give an assurance that things are okay, but if they're not okay, to point out what the consequences can actually be. It's not my job to fix the problem. The solution is really down to your management. And interestingly enough, I'm one of the very few assurance providers who I don't make recommendations. I just say, this is the way it is. It's up to you to accept it or not, as the case may be. If you accept it, it's up to you to fix it. I'm not going to tell you what the solution should be because I probably don't know enough about your business. I don't know enough about your technology. I don't know enough about your organisational structure. You know more than that than I do. Now I've given you the problem, you come up with the solution. And I really do love dealing with my American cousins on this because once they accept there's a problem, and persuading them can be a little bit tricky because they don't take it at face value. They're very, very challenging on show me that I've definitely got a problem. But once they accept it, they just go and fix it. They don't hang around. They don't say, we're going to put this off to the next meeting in 3 months' time. They just do it there and then. And this happened in one of my clients in America at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I always had a closed down meeting every day to say, this is what I found today. And I found a significant problem. I pointed it out to them. They accepted it after a little bit of toing and froing. And they said, okay, John, you go back to your hotel. Tomorrow morning we'll have a solution. I found out that they stayed there until 1 o'clock in the morning to get an acceptable solution. So when I went back the next day, they put the solution to me and said, now could you actually measure us against this proposed solution? Which I could, that would actually work. But it was down to them, it's not down to me. I'm an assurance provider, I'm not an assurance maker. There's a number of challenges along the route now, especially with the regulatory framework being the way it is. The guys at the top and the girls, if I say guys, it means girls, let's get over this. The people at the top, they would like to have assurance that things are well controlled, especially on the IT side. So management, IT management, the Chief Information Officer, will make representations to the board to say, yes, we're fine in this particular area. And it's someone like me who then looks at that representation and says whether I think it's reliable or not, as the case may be. Rather like the Chief Information Officer who told his board, well, we're not accredited to 27,000, but we operate to it, which is a huge challenge to someone like me because I have to do a gap analysis. Here's the 27,000 standard, and here's what they're actually doing. Is there a gap? Well, the gap is so wide, my arms weren't actually wide enough. But he'd been using these weasel words, we operate to it, rather than accredited against it. But to be fair, in any organisation, there's only limited assurance resources. And we've got a huge operation these days. IT is pervasive throughout the business. So I've got to be very selective in the areas I give assurance over. This wouldn't be too bad if things were stable, but they're not. We've got a very dynamic business environment at the moment. Decisions are made, solutions are proposed, solutions are implemented in a very, very short timescale. The statutory compliance requirements coming out from organisations like the Financial Conduct Authority are continually being amended. And then on top of that, we have the regulations, perhaps coming from the EU. You've got the new Data Protection Directive. By 2018, your business has got to be compliant with the Data Protection Directive. Now, I'm an assurance provider, so I'm looking at this in a number of organisations. All I can say is I'm really pleased that they've got a year or so to sort themselves out. They haven't actually even got to grips with the fact that members of the board will be personally liable if there's a data protection breach. Although once I point that out to them, it really does focus the mind. So this is your IT operation as seen by others, or you hope. No. Hopefully you want the others to see it like this. Everything is calm on the surface. Everything is smooth. The IT provision and service is working absolutely fine. Now, you as assurance providers, security officers, or whatever your job may be, you know if you dip your toe in that water, the crocodile will drag you in, the giant squid will wrap its tentacles around you, and the shark will bite off your extremities. Because to get that at the top there, you've got to avoid this. You know that very smooth surface can be very quickly and easily disrupted by an IT failure. And the IT failure may be one of confidentiality, it may be of integrity, it may be of availability, or it may even be today of compliance. It's a very, very rough world underneath that very, very smooth surface we see. Now, we tend to know that as assurance providers. The tricky thing is, how do we prove to senior management that the work we do in providing assurance is actually adding value to the business? It's even more complicated because in any business, there are a number of different stakeholders. We have the audit committee. Now, the BCS has an audit committee. I'm a member of that audit committee, and we take our responsibilities quite seriously. We want absolute, concrete evidence that our financial affairs are in order. A lot of IT is needed to produce today's accounts. So we want an assurance that our computer systems can actually be relied on. Local management, the people at the coalface who are doing the job, they want practical solutions. They don't want theoretical mumbo-jumbo coming through. They expect some concrete solution to their business problems. As I said, that's not my challenge, that's challenge of the organisation itself. The chief executive is really interested in value. I'm spending several £100,000 per year on my assurance providers. What I'm actually getting from these in the way of added value to the business. The business directors of finance, marketing, IT, production, sales, they want to actually know, are we getting real benefits from the IT investment we're actually making? And of course, any external assessors out there, they want to know that you're actually operating quality processes. And the quality processes are quite important. One of my large insurance clients, going back 10 years or so, they decided to go for ISO 9000 accreditation, which they successfully achieved in well under 2 years. But as a result of documenting all of their processes, it meant that when the Financial Services Authority, the predecessor of the FCA, came into them to actually do a review of their computer processes, they were pretty much bulletproof. Everything was well documented, their controls were being tested, they had accreditation against ISO 27000 and ISO 20000, so they were pretty much okay on security and service delivery. So they actually passed the FSA tests with very, very good results. And that was an example of assurance actually adding value to the business, because you probably know other insurance companies were not so fortunate at the time. So here's the big challenge for senior management. They want assurance over IT in two major areas. The first one is, are we conforming with best practice? Are we conforming to the financial regulations that are out there, or whatever other regulations we have to adhere to, depending on the industry sector that we're actually in? But more importantly, are we really getting value for money on the performance side from our investment in IT? Now, you'll know as assurance providers, proving conformance is no great problem because you've got a baseline. And you can measure against that baseline for any deviations, and you report on the deviations, then ask management, does this deviation really matter? If it does, how are you going to actually sort it out? Performance is far more of a challenge because the baseline is a variable. It will depend on where your organisation is in the maturity of its IT. It will depend on what it actually needs to provide to actually beat the competition. It will depend on what the board actually wants and the individual directors on those boards for their individual departments. So actually determining what the performance baseline should be for all those stakeholders I mentioned previously is quite a tricky thing. And it's where the real challenge actually comes in adding value to the business. Once you've actually set that baseline, then it becomes a conformance problem. You can say, are we actually meeting that baseline? And you'll immediately think of service level agreements and the like. But here are the main questions. You'll see the basic questions are exactly the same for each of these 4 IT sectors that I've listed there. The first thing is, you're an assurance provider. So if things go wrong, why didn't you warn people that things were likely to go wrong? But the more tricky thing is, if things go okay, what value did you add in making sure they were going okay? And it's that second one that is the more tricky of these 2 questions we actually have over these 4 IT sectors. So first of all, let's deal with the first one. If things go wrong, why didn't we actually warn them? Well, the usual reason is we actually haven't looked at it yet. And there's the big challenge, isn't it? There's only a limited number of us, and there's a huge amount of IT actually out there. How do we ensure that we cover all the important parts at an appropriate time? And of course, you'll immediately fall back on, we'll do risk management, we'll look at where the risky things are in the business, and then we'll actually deal with them on a prioritisation basis. We'll see that that has some problems in just a moment. But the more important thing, I guess, from our professional integrity is if things go okay, they'll say, well, what value did you add to the business? Well, I think the value we add is actually telling them that things are okay. You know, it's a much better thing, isn't it? Yes, things are actually okay. You've got very little chance of having a failure here. If you do have a failure, you've got a business continuity plan in place, and we think you actually will come out okay. I think that's good. It gives you a nice, comfortable feeling. And of course, we have a number of toolkits available to us. We know that if any IT department has a number of areas that's going to be providing a service on. I've very crudely here, I've used the CIA model, confidentiality, integrity, availability. And you'll notice sneakily, I've added compliance on there because compliance now is a major business risk. If you don't comply, you're going to get fined, you're going to get bad publicity, they may even shut down your business. And that really is a major, major problem. Especially the tax man. So we need to actually be aware that if we want to actually give an assurance that is of value to the business, we need to break it down into these sort of segments that we have here. And what management are really interested in is the ongoing reliability of the processes. And now one of the challenges we have is we tend to go in at a particular time and we take a snapshot. And from that snapshot, we extrapolate what the future is going to actually look like. But of course, the future itself is it's a murky crystal ball out there, isn't it? You look into it, you try to guess what's going to happen in 3 or 4 years' time. It's very, very difficult. The big challenge we have with IT is we really have no history. Okay, we've been around for 50 odd years, we have no history because things come in very discrete chunks of change. The technology changes very, very quickly. 5 years ago, we didn't really have cloud, and now cloud is one of the major things. 10 years ago, you did not have the internet, and now the internet is the big thing. So we get these changes that are coming along within possibly the lifetime of our assurance horizon. We can say, okay, yeah, you're all right now. You're probably going to be all right in a year's time. We've got no idea what's going to look like in 3 years' time. We can only do the now. On the performance side, the value for money concept. This is what management is really quite interested in. The conformance side, they can actually see, okay, yeah, we need to actually meet this particular regulatory requirement. It's actually set there as a baseline. When it comes to really IT providing value for money, you can have all these fancy equations of, is IT efficient in what it's providing in the way of a service? Is it effective in producing new business solutions on its development side? And is it actually got a good relationship between its costs to its deliverables? However, you play around with all these things and you'll all know, if you want to make a business case for a new business solution, it almost certainly has to meet the internal rate of return that the company has set. So let's say it's an 8% return. So you have to fit all the figures to show that the investment in this business solution is going to give you an 8% return. I honestly don't know why we're worrying about this stuff. I really do not. If you look at the entire economic life cycle of a business solution, from the requirements through to decommissioning, the development side is only 20% of the entire thing. The other 80% is keeping it going once it goes live, doing the maintenance, doing the enhancements, and all that sort of stuff. So even if this thing goes over budget by 100%, it's only 20% multiplied by 2, 40% of the total cost of this thing down there. And also, we have to remember, if we assume on my original premise that the value of IT to the business is the value of the business, there is no way you can ever spend too much on IT. You really can't. The other thing that we have in a way of an advantage over other assurance providers is we know exactly what IT should be doing. We know that any IT department, no matter where it is in the world, no matter what industry sector it's in, whether it does things in-house or outsources them, it only does two things. The first thing it does is develop, acquire, and implement new business solutions. Technically, we call it systems development, the SDLC, System Development Lifecycle, for shorthand. The other thing the IT department does, it delivers those business solutions to the users, to the customers, and maintains them and provides a service. We call it service delivery. Every IT department, no matter where it is in the world, does those things, only those two things. In order to do those two things, we know it has to have an organisational structure, has to have some sort of planning and governance structure to actually mould the solutions. And then in order to know whether you've achieved your objectives, you need some sort of performance monitoring. So the planning and organisation of IT and the performance monitoring are the wrapper that goes around system development and service delivery. Now, because we know that this is what IT departments are doing, we can actually break these down to processes, and we know from the work we've actually done that there's a number of common processes that will be used throughout the world. If we know what the process looks like, then we can actually say we can do an assurance job against that process. Now, it's not all easy because most of IT is totally invisible. If you look at this pyramid here, you can see the hardware and you can see the people. You can't see the base software, you can't see the application software, you can't see the data, and you can't see the network transactions. So the two things we can see are the hardware, and you can object.
So you're using the word see as individualized. Now, you don't have to see things with your eyes to sense things like their availability, reliability, portability, and other characteristics, which is the essence of what you want to see.
That's not the essence of assurance. We'll come back to that. I accept. I can see where you're coming from, the visible representation of the invisible, and I'll come back to it. You can see the hardware, you can see the people. Any chief finance officer knows that this stuff, the hardware, is getting cheaper every 6 months. And yet every time the CIO goes to the CFO, there's more zeros on the budget. You can see the people, but these IT people, they speak a slightly strange language. You may have some doubts about their personal hygiene, and they certainly don't dress like normal people. So there's a bit of suspicion about, are these people actually adding value to the business? But this invisible stuff there is a major challenge in providing assurance. The second thing I've got there is end user computing. I've called it bandit country. And it goes a bit like this. Your chief information officer or chief technology officer or whatever you call that person can probably give you some assurance over anything below data on that pyramid. Because over the years, we've learned by our mistakes. We've got pretty good controls in place. We train our people appropriately. We have quality assurance built in and things of that particular nature. And then, of course, we give this stuff to the users. We call it end user computing. These people are not trained in any sensible data processing control techniques, but we give them immense power. We give them spreadsheets, the most dangerous thing in the universe after the nuclear weaponry that we actually have. PwC 3 years ago said that 1/3 of all the spreadsheets they examined as part of their normal audit activities, 1/3 of them had a material error within them. And yet we give these things out willy-nilly to our users. The Financial Conduct Authority says you must control your critical spreadsheets. that implies you need to identify your critical spreadsheets. And that's a significant problem. And then once you've identified them, you need to put some sort of control harness around them. It is another problem you actually have to deal with. The other thing, coming back to the people, the technology we can control absolutely. The technology will do exactly what we tell it day in and day out without deviation. People have this thing called free will. People can do what they like. And until we start chipping people at birth, which I'm sure the government would love to do, and give them electric shocks if they deviate from what the government deems to be reasonable, we can only manage people. It's a huge difference. We can control the technology, we can only manage the people. We try to manage them by policies, standards and procedures, but because people have free will, they can deviate from those. They actually don't have to follow them. So this challenge between managing people who deliver the IT to controlling the IT is a totally different challenge. I can give assurance over your IT. I can't give any assurance over your people, and the people are the people who are managing the IT in the first instance. The question here, of course, is we try to put separation of responsibilities into organisations. We try to separate front office from the back office, and yet all the time we have people out there who will actually bend the rules. So we had Nick Leeson in Singapore, who brought down Barings Bank. We had John Rusnak in the States, who did a similar thing to Allied Irish Bank. Didn't destroy the bank, it cost them a lot of money and some bad publicity. I'm afraid that no, with the best will in the world, we can put in potential controls over people, but we can't control the people, we only manage them. They can do exactly what they want.
On that front, would your approach to assurance have spotted the theory generalis where a chap who had been on the technical side was promoted into trading and abused his prior expertise?
I really can't answer that, because the fact is, I don't know what the internal organisation controls were within Society Generale.
Assuming a control was absent that precluded someone with the technical expertise moving into trading, would that show up on your radar?
I've no idea, because without looking at it as a specific job, I just got no idea. It'd just be generalisations which don't help people at all. Sorry? Segregation of duties is part of it, but the point here is you've got segregation of duties, but this person had the technical expertise to circumnavigate the separation.
Temporal chain, not a coincidence of duties. It's rather difficult to spot.
It is. However, my job would be to look at that particular process, if I decided it was a risky process, to actually look at all aspects of that particular risk. However, going back to the fact that your CIO can manage that bit in the pyramid there, the fact is, of course, life isn't that simple. Most of IT now is outside of Chief Information Officer. We're using outsourcing, we're using cloud computing, none of which was in our control. And we start looking for third-party assurance provided by someone about which we might know very little, issuing us with a certificate to say, yes, your cloud computing provider has good management, confidentiality, integrity, availability, and compliance. And of course, we all feel uncomfortable when relying on someone else. I mean, us auditors, we never trust anyone else. I'm afraid you have to. If you get a suitably qualified person or organisation saying, we've done a job in reviewing this particular company and we've measured them against international standards or whatever the baseline is, we think they pass, then you have to accept that. But otherwise, you'll be auditing the entire universe in order to say your payroll system is okay. And that, of course, is just not a cost-effective way of doing something. Also, it's what I call rear-end protection. If something suddenly goes wrong and you've got a piece of headed note paper from a Big Four provider and they've said everything is okay, then if something goes wrong, it's really down to them and not down to you. Coming back to the way IT actually works, this is taken from COBIT, Control Objectives for IT, provided by one of our sister organisations, ISACA. ISACA is not a Japanese restaurant, it's the Information Systems Audit and Control Association, and primarily they say, no matter what your IT department is, no matter where it actually operates, these are the major processes that it actually does. There's about 36 or 37 of them. It means we can take that process as defined by ISACA, based on best practice. ISACA actually determines what the risks are likely to be in that particular process area and what the appropriate control mechanisms may be. And you can use that as a template to measure how well or how badly your particular IT department is doing in that specific area. So you could look at managed changes. Change management in most organisations is a joke. To call it change management is a joke. To call it change control is even worse. Most change control processes do nothing of the sort. They're just fancy spreadsheets, fancy flowcharts, which say, if everyone does exactly the way we want them to do it, then this will be okay. It's all based on trust, and trust is not a control, ladies and gentlemen. I said that although a lot of IT is invisible, all is not lost. We have a number of frameworks out there. I mentioned COBIT. These are some of the international standards relating to business continuity and information technology. I don't intend to go through them in detail because I'm sure you all know exactly what they are. If you don't know what they are, then when this presentation comes up on the website, probably in a few days' time, you really need to go back and look at them and say, should our organisation be considering this as a particular baseline for anything we do in the organisation? So everyone knows ISO 9000, the quality standard. Everyone knows that ISO 27000 is information security. Almost everyone knows that 20000 is service delivery. But of course, we have standards 25010 for software quality, which is pretty important if you're actually delivering a business solution. We have a standard up here, 38500. That's IT governance. That's your CIO running your IT department. See how well he or she stacks up against 38500. We've got ISO 31000, risk management. IRMA has had a huge input into the latest and updating of that particular standard. There's a whole chunk in there provided solely by BCS IRMA, which wasn't there when we actually got it coming through. It's not as if we're just doing a few, let's check this sentence here or that paragraph there. This is a complete new section we actually put in. Then, of course, I've got CMM, Capability Maturity Modelling. And more importantly, ISO 15504, the capability of a particular process to meet its business objective. And we have a way of measuring any one of those processes I mentioned earlier for COBIT. We can take any one of those processes, we can say your particular IT department, and we can measure you against an international standard to see how well or how poorly you're actually doing, and then you can make a decision as to whether you want to accept at that level or do something different.
The CMM and the associated ISO standard, they only measure the performance of a probably you have with
That's-
change control.
That's not entirely true. On 15504, the very first thing you have to do is to specify what the quality of the result will actually be. It's not just this is a result, it has to be an acceptable level of result for the process concerned. So you're halfway there, but not totally there. The fact is, it doesn't matter too much whether these meanings are exactly the same between the two particular mechanisms. The fact is, if you're below level 3, you've got a problem. If you're at level 3, you still have a problem, but you don't know it. Because level 3 basically says, this is what the process is. Remember these people with free will? We've got no way of actually knowing whether they're actually following the process unless we put in some metrics to actually determine, would we identify deviations from this particular process? So ideally, you probably want to be at level 4 on your key IT processes. And if you're not doing these things in-house, maybe you want some assurance that the providers are at level 4. We have a huge, the question was really along the lines of, we have very short duration projects now, so what's the likelihood of meeting these particular levels in these particular requirements? I would actually say quite high, because if you're an organisation that's operating agile development methods, then you can actually ensure your agile development method is at level 4 maturity, and then every development you plug into it will actually be measured against that level. So I don't think it's a major problem. But coming back, and it almost ties into what you raised earlier, one of my major clients, a large oil company, when Sarbanes-Oxley came out in America, they said it cost them $50 million to become Sarbanes-Oxley compliant. The reason was not because they were a particularly bad organisation, but they had not actually really identified and documented and measured their effectiveness of their controls. So the cost was actually doing the baseline stuff that a lot of other organisations have done anyway. Which brings me to another challenge I face. I go into organisations, I talk to the CIO, and we get to the area where they say to me, we're not going to be accredited against ISO 27000 because it's too expensive. And I say to them, no, it's not. I said, if you're actually operating, supposed at that standard, it's probably going to cost you about £5,000 to get full accreditation. And they look at me in amazement, and then you find out they haven't got any documented processes in place. And that's where the cost is. But yeah, but actually, if you look at most IT departments, with the thousands of controls they could potentially have, it actually comes down to a baseline of only 8 or 9 anyway. Really, really significant ones. But what I say to you as assurance providers, it's always better to operate against an international baseline yourself and measure your client against that baseline, because when they say, whose crazy idea is this? You say, well, actually, it's an international standard. Now, if you've got something better, then please tell me. But if you haven't, just shut up and get on with it. Coming back to the 36 or 37 processes that your IT department may or may not be operating, you can actually break it down into IT supports the business. We've said this several times. We've said the reason for IT is there to support the business, and that's why IT is the value of the business. We can take a number of IT processes, any single IT process, and we can break it down into how do we actually manage it for conformance, control objectives, assurance guidelines, and all those lovely, comfortable things we actually discuss. And if we get to performance, have we got any KPIs, KGIs, or maturity models on which to measure how well or how badly we're doing? So in fact, we've got an immense toolkit out there. We're far better off than many other assurance providers. We've got COBIT, Control Objective for IT. We've got a vast number of international standards. Each of those international standards is risk-based. Each of those international standards will identify the risks associated with compliance with the standard and the potential controls you might consider to actually have in place. And you can take that together, and it means you can go in with some confidence to any organisation with its IT department, either in-house or it may even be outsourced. And you can actually do a very, very thorough, very accurate job on measuring how well or how badly they're doing. Now, of course, we discussed the fact that business is very dynamic these days, and technology, of course, is ultimately the most dynamic thing of all. What I've tried to show here, the things in red, are where there's been a significant change in the technology that has impacted upon our ability to control the technology. As you see from the very start, batch processing. The big challenge there was we had document processing, manual documents, pieces of paper, and suddenly we took these pieces of paper and we put them into the computer system. We went from visible pieces of paper to invisible transactions on the system. And that presented a major control problem to us, visible to invisible. But we overcome it, and we were quite happy we could actually give assurance that a particular batch system would meet its objectives. Then, of course, the technologists developed real-time update. So we went from a situation of having a well-controlled process for converting a document into electronic format. We now go to a situation where any end user at a workstation could generate a transaction and have an immediate hit on the database with no document required at all. None of the standard audit trails were there. Immense change. If you think about batch processing, it's all about prevention controls. Real-time update is all about detection controls, because you can't prevent someone with the privileges to do a particular job, you can't prevent them doing that job poorly or deliberately actually manipulating the system. You're given the privileges. You can't prevent them doing it, so you have to rely on detection. So we've gone from a prevention control process to a detection control process. Then we moved on to networking. It was no longer essential for these people to be directly connected to the main computer. They can now be anywhere in the world. Then we had the big challenge of completeness. How do we know we've captured all the transactions? How do we know the transactions have gone through and hit the central database? But we sort of got to grips with that. We had known users out there. We knew how many there were. We knew that these users, we could identify them with user IDs and authentication processes. We eventually got to grips with that. Then, of course, we get the internet, which is very public. And once you've got the internet, you've got a website. The website says to the hackers, come and get me. And of course, they do. So we have another change in our control paradigm. Now we've got cloud computing out there. Now we have software as a service. We have storage as a service, infrastructure as a service. We've got really no idea where our stuff is being stored, which presents major problems when it comes to the various data protection legislation. We've got no idea who's actually looking at it. We've got no idea how secure it is. We have no idea of the reliability of the software as a service we're actually buying. And coming a bit further down, we've got a lot of robotics out there at the moment. Most of your cars are built by robots using very sophisticated computer-controlled tools, but they are specific artificial intelligence. We can measure against the baseline, does this robot do what it's required to do? But just up the road now, we've got general artificial intelligence. We're moving into driverless cars, and from driverless cars, we're going to almost any automation you can actually think of. And we haven't the faintest idea, really, how to give assurance over things of that nature. You think of robotics and controlling general artificial intelligence, and you think of the 3 laws of robotics from Isaac Asimov. If you don't know what they are, you need to go and look them up. They provide a baseline on how we might control general artificial intelligence, but so far, no one really knows how to build the model of Asimov's 3 laws.
I can just point out Asimov created those laws to demonstrate how ineffectual they were.
Yes, because all his stories,
They're in conflict with
all his stories
Yes.
were based around of how do you actually get around these 3 laws of robotics. So we know we're at the situation now. 2/3 of our graduates at the moment, 2/3 of our undergraduates, the jobs we're training them for will not exist in 10 years' time. And there'll be 2/3 of them doing jobs that we don't know even exist at the moment. So we're trying to look into the future based with very little history in the past to actually base any judgments on. You look at the risk management equation, it's likelihood, probability, call it whatever you like, consequence and impact. So it's likelihood and consequence. The consequence we can calculate pretty much absolutely. We know that if we lose our IT services, what it would actually cost the business. The big challenge is how likely is this to happen? It's just a guess. Just a guess, and your guess is as good as mine. However, what I would say, if you're trying to apply this to, is someone likely to penetrate your systems in the next 3 years? The answer is yes. Just worry about the consequence. Don't worry about the likelihood. I guarantee it's actually going to happen. So I say to my main boards, wouldn't you rather know from me how bad things actually are before someone else finds out? And the answer is, well, yeah, it would be nice to know. I tell them that they can probably fix something now, if they know about it, much cheaper and actually probably more effectively than if they have to do it in the full glare of a public inquiry. And they sort of get that message too. I also point out to them that they asked me at the very beginning, what's the value of the work I do? And I think it goes like this. If I tell them they're okay, and I've measured this to the best of my ability against a good international baseline, then that should give them some sort of comfort. That they don't have to worry too much about that area. Let's deal with these areas where John isn't giving us the comfort that we so crave. I had a strap line to my presentation. It comes from Karl Popper. And Karl said, we don't know what we don't know until we know it. My job, I see, is trying to actually give them the unknown unknowns before someone else actually finds out about it. And here's a typical situation of, do they understand what you're actually telling them? So here's a situation. The engineer's wife left in some instructions to cook the pie. The pie needs to be taken out of the fridge. He's obviously done that and placed in the oven at 140 degrees, which he's done exactly the way it should be. The instructions left a big gap in interpretation. The engineer interpreted them one way, his wife would have interpreted them the other way. This is one of the challenges we face. when it comes to reporting our findings, we shouldn't use ambiguous statements. We should say, this is the way it is, people. If you live with this it is at the moment, you could face a massive fine from the regulator or criminal sanctions against you personally or bad publicity. Your shareholders will be very upset. We should be totally unambiguous about it. And I assure you that statements along the line of port 80 on the firewall is insecure will not earn you any friends whatsoever. So a couple of closing thoughts on this. So Robert Peel, when he set up the police force in 1829, he said, the test of police efficiency is the absence of crime, not the visible evidence of coppers walking around on the beat. You see, he was measuring outputs rather than inputs. And the big danger we have today is we measure inputs when we should be concentrating on the outputs. He probably did, being Sir Robert himself. So here is my closing thought on this. Your test of assurance effectiveness is the absence of bad things happening to your business. It's not measured by the work you're actually doing. If you're doing your job properly and you point out the good things they don't have to worry about, but more importantly, the bad things they have to fix, and they fix them before there's a problem, then you know you've actually added some value to the business. Questions, please.
Your proper quote was taken up, of course, by Rumsfeld, his famous quote after the debacle of...
Yeah, Rumsfeld, the Secretary of State, said there are known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. Yes.
The thing he missed was the Dunning-Kruger effect, the second component of which is things you're convinced of that happen to be wrong.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how you deal with that, because that's very difficult to deal with that.
Well, there's another famous quote, isn't there? For any particular situation, there's always a simple solution which is totally wrong. And that's the way it goes. That's why I do not make recommendations. I do not promote the solution. That's the business's job. That's their paycheck. It's not my paycheck.
The reason I'm upset there is I'm actually in the position currently of doing roughly speaking what you're doing with the responsibility for the results of the vision. And we have someone who's come up with the very thing which is wrong, which he's convinced of, which is going to drive everything down the bug hole. I'm wondering if you have any insight in how one deals with that.
Well, personally, I wouldn't deal with it because I'm not in your situation. I would say that is your. If you think that's your solution, I can advise against it, but it's entirely up to you whether you actually go ahead. Because I've had a number of failures in convincing people they've got a problem for the thing to actually then go wrong sometimes several years later. I call it "I told you so" file. No, it's not just you. At the back, sir.
I'm of the nature that I like to get numbers and evidence that anybody's ideas will be books. Okay. By the way, I am the acknowledged inventor of CMM Level 4 at the Vancouver Park. I've just sent you proof of it by email. Okay? That's the Vancouver Park. So could you give me an example of somebody, and I agree with your idea that the absence of problems is also a measure of the activity. Okay. Could you give me an example of somebody actually, an institution involved, actually setting a goal for a degree of absence of these problems and perhaps actually achieving them with some architecture or ideas?
Yeah, so system development. If you take any system development process, you get the coder who unit tests the solution. That is then passed to the system people who do some sort of chain test of the thing, some sort of system test. So let's take the first thing. The programmer, the coder, he or she tests the code until they're happy it's okay. And then they pass it up to the systems guys. The system people test it in a complete solution. If they find bugs at that stage, what should happen is coder should have their bonus reduced, and the systems guys have their bonus increased. The system people say the solution is now okay. They visit the end users. If the end users find problems in it, then the systems guys have their bonus taken away, and the user actually has the bonus increased. So you have a measurable effect. And actually, what this tends to do, it does change behaviour, because people will not let the thing go, will not sign it off until they're happy that it actually is bug-free.
Isn't that the problem?
I like your example, it's interesting, and I know it well, but I was actually asking for something broader, like looking at the whole issue of, say, security. Okay? Are there any case studies where you could look at somebody saying, our security is a certain atrocious level, and we want to get to a much better level, and then they do something, employ techniques and architecture, and then they provably get to the level. That would be proof of concept, that you can systematically manage these things and achieve known levels.
Yes.
Good.
Go to the Osaka website.
Say it so I can.
The Information System Auditors Association website.
Okay. You help us with that.
Go to COBIT testimonials,
Yes.
and you will find at least one example in there of exactly what you want. It comes from one of the very large banks.
Yes.
On their system development side, they measured them initially, and on CMN they're at level 2, which, as you know, is repeatable, but if you lose your staff, you've got a serious problem. And by improving their CMM measurements to level 4, I think they were saving something like 800 million euros a year in development costing, because they were getting it right the first time. So that's the sort of things you actually need. You need to go in and look at these testimonials of by adopting not COBIT is not an international standard, but it's an international baseline. By adopting international baselines, by getting to an appropriate level on those baselines, and I think level 4 of either CMM
level 4
or
is-
15504.
4 is whereby you can predict the output and it is repeatable, and basically it is managed. It's at the area whereby you know what's going to happen when you do something.
What we crave, and what management crave, is predictability of a process.
Yeah.
So this process will day in and day out produce the same result.
Yeah.
It's predictability. And that's what we do.
And reliability.
This is why we have controls. Controls give us predictability. That's the only reason we have them.
But it was the predictability of varies that like Nick Leeson's work. Because it was predictable, month after month after month. He was reporting fraudulent.
The concept of the confidentiality actually comes.
Sorry, excuse me, sorry, there was just a moment.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Nick Leeson was fraudulently reporting month after month. He was handling front office transactions and back
Yes.
office transactions, but Barings loved the reports. Because
Yeah.
We had segregation and duties issues that nobody picked up on.
and they still loved the profits
Right,
coming in.
it-
reporting.
And the same thing happened with John Rusnak in America, who was working for Allied Irish Bank. He did exactly a Nick Leeson. And despite the history of Nick Leeson, Allied Irish Bank said, we love the money he's generating. And I agree. But that was not a failure of the audit. The auditors actually detected the problem. They reported the main board ignored it.
But it's perverse incentives all the time.
Oh, yes, it does indeed.
Particularly
Yeah.
in the financial services
Yeah.
sector, which I come from.
Yeah, no, it is a massive problem. And I'm not going to gloss over it. All I can say is our job is to point out where there's a potential problem. It's up to management to sort it. Sorry, there's a question on that. The green calculator.
Okay, I was going to point out, the whole level 2, and many people don't know this, so it's worth pointing out, is initially based on the work of Sheward-Deming statistical process control, where the idea is if you can get a predictable and stable system, you can then introduce change with the objective of getting better, and measure whether it's actually getting better. This, we know the intellectual roots of that.
Sure.
You have, like everyone else that ever spoken or listened to, referred to a CIO as essentially an IT leader. Where do you in that case put the CTO? I've consulted on this where the two of them sit side
Well, I mean, you've hit it there. The CIO is responsible for information. The CTO is responsible for the technology to actually manage that information. But the challenge with titles is they vary from organisation to organisation. A lot of organisations now have a COO, a Chief Operating Officer, who has IT and HR and facilities management. I can't get too fussed over what the actual title is. I want to know what they're meant to be doing.
Not title, but I see no governance over the information beyond the technology in most organizations, up to multinationals that I've been.
You know, you're absolutely right. The thing I find fascinating, if you look at ISO 27000, it is information security, it's not computer security, but try and get that message over. Sorry, no, there's a question here.
I was just thinking about the fact that, wondering if you've come across in your sector an issue I've come across in mine, which is aviation safety, which is limitation of scope. I can think of two instances where I've actually had to look at a system for compliance for safety regulations, and I've identified that the system is likely to completely shut down the country's air traffic control system. On both occasions, they said, well, you're only assessing it for safety, it will shut it down safely, and it is therefore compliant with the regulations. That's happened to me twice, and on both occasions the incident has happened, and it shut down the countries, two different countries, it shut down their complete airspace.
I had the same one on the computer, some very simple thing, computer room. The computer room had temperature controls. But nobody ever thought this that in North Wales the temperature would drop one, believe it or not, New Year's Eve to -15. One freak night. The temperature control said above such and such and below such and such. It was -10. So the whole bloody thing closed down. Luckily, it was New Year's Eve. Because the very first week in January is the one week in the entire year when a retail company can afford for its systems to go.
Okay, there's one last question because I'm over time. No, not you, it's him.
In the space where the FM guys are, the guys that do the repair, just be aware that there's a free pass on the BSI website, which means it's always free to download, both copies of it. So you've got a free standard that the FM guys can have for security and build control. And I'd encourage you to add that to your list. And because it's free, these guys who will never have budget for IT security can have a standard of their own in their head and speak.
Do you know what the standard number is? Sorry, what is it? Okay, I was going to say it because obviously here we want to actually say what the standard is. Ladies and gentlemen, what we're saying is there are standards for facilities management 1192-4, which is totally free.
Yes,
No, that's it. You have to get me afterwards.
yes, standard or ISO standard.
Okay, I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, but we're well over time. Thank you for your attention. It's been much appreciated. I'm going to be around for a few minutes here to take your questions offline. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for challenging, thoughtful, and as usual, very helpful topic and talk. Please help yourself with sandwich and drink. And also, I wanted to ask if any of you not member of the IRMA linking group, you're quite welcome, and we encourage you, please join our linking group. Terrific wish to be on. If you wish.
You're allowed 10 specialist groups listings.
5.
Five, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.